I'm originally from Crow, so I'm not from here. Um, I have two sons. One is 8, one is 4, and I've been living in Browning for about 9 years now. And so both my kids, are in school here. And culture has shaped my life ever since I was small. Starting with, sun dances, we were always around them. Um, and just being around family in general, that's a big part of, Native culture. And so we've always been around family. We've always had family support. I moved to Browning, and, it's a different tribe, but there's still the concept of family that's important. And we do a lot of family um, events and gatherings. And so that's still a big part of who I am today. And the reason I got into teaching was because of my first son. He started to go to school, and I realized at that point I didn't know what he should be doing or learning in school. Growing up, I didn't have that kind of support on my mom's side. I'm a first generation college student, and so growing up, I didn't have a lot of, I couldn't ask her for a lot of help. She barely graduated high school herself. Um, and just the stability of moving so much when I was younger. I know that I wanted different for my sons, and so then I started wanting to learn more about it, and I got my foot in the door, so to speak, as a TA here in the preschool program about 7 or 8 years ago, and through that I've gone to school, and now I'm a lead teacher in our program. I teach preschool here in Browning. Uh, like I said, I was with a wonderful mentor next door for 7 years. And so, yeah, just the things I learned at the Sundance, the value of family, the value of, having that support is a pivotal aspect of culture. And it's what I pass down to my sons. I know a lot of our families around here are raised like that. And so family shapes what we do in the classroom in a big way. My family, so to speak, I guess if I had to trace it back to one person, my great-grandmother, Susie Walking Bear Yellowtail, she was one of the first registered nurses here in Montana, Native American nurses, and she was just, in general, a strong advocate for all kids, and that was passed down to my grandma, and my grandma is still this way today, where she would go and sit in the back of classrooms and make sure the kids are learning what they're, supposed to be learning, and kind of keep an eye on you. And so she's always, been a strong advocate of education too. And so in turn, that was passed down to my dad, um, and my dad, yeah, just, it didn't matter what I did as long as, I was getting my education. They've, really influenced me to do that. And like we said, my mentor next door, it wasn't something that when I applied to be a TA, it wasn't, I'm going to be a teacher. It was more so to help my son. And then as the years passed, I thought, yeah, I'm good with, I like kids. I like being around kids, and the opportunity came up to get my degree, and I went for it. The children I work with are all Native American. I work on the reservation, and so they're all Native. Mostly all Blackfeet, and I build relationships with the families, starting from the beginning of the year. Whether it's a phone call or meeting them, I think it's important to build that relationship with them. And I like to keep a clear line of communication open with them. If they need to call me, they can call me. I send home weekly newsletters so they know what we're doing in our classroom and how they can help their child at home, and just taking the opportunity to build that, because without them, it's hard to teach. The families, I would say, they're mostly similar. Um, I have a lot of students. We have had a lot of students in the years who are raised by grandparents, that's a very large part of, our school and district-wide. There's many grandparents raising kids, their grandkids, and so, you have to do things different for them, and really break things down because it's way different from when they were in school. And I guess in the sense that they're all mostly Blackfeet is how they're similar. They do come from different, situations that can, either do help or hinder them. And I feel like it's my job to figure out kind of where they come from in a family so I can figure out how to help them and teach them. To be honest, I look for every opportunity to include their culture. And, like at the beginning of the year, our unit is actually on families. And as I said before, that's a big aspect of culture, especially on the reservation. And so at that point, I'm, getting to know who their families are. We have lots of discussions about, how they help at home, how their families have fun, how they're similar to each other in the classroom, also how they're different. Some of them are more, ceremonial, and some of them aren't. And so it's fun to see the differences and that we have in our classroom. What I like to do at the beginning of the year is have them draw their families. And at that point, so I'm learning from them, okay, well, he lives with grandma and grandpa. She, is back and forth between mom and dad. And so at that point, we're getting to know, who their families are. And so that's one way that I include the families. In our community, we just, that's our unit now. But earlier in the year, we took a walking field trip to the museum here. And it's the Museum of the Plains Indian. And so they were able to see, all the regalia and the beading and a lot of artifacts and paintings they have there that incorporate Blackfeet knowledge, Blackfeet history. And so that's exciting to be able to tell them, this is from so many years ago, but it's still part of your culture. And then if we look over here, we can see, this is Crow, and that's how their beadwork's different. And it's fun because they have those all lined up and they can see the differences. So in that aspect, we were able to include parts of our community, which was the museum, which in turn, included their culture. To build culturally safe environments, I think that's a large part, for the teacher to be aware of what is culturally appropriate, and to challenge your beliefs on that. When I thought of the word safe, I thought of, making my kids feel safe in my classroom. And one way we do that is at the beginning of the year, I was able to ask my students' families if they were okay with me smudging in here and praying, and because they bought us smudge kits. And praying in school, that's a big, how do I explain that to 4-year-olds? But we were able to include it because we wish our classmates well when they aren't here. And I was able to explain to my students that when we pray, it's just good, positive words. When we smudge, I want you to think of someone, put them in your heart, and wish them well. And so I was able to include that, tie that in with our social, emotional stuff. But like I said, making sure that the things you're teaching them aren't stereotypical, they aren't racist, making it culturally appropriate for them, including their culture. I have a lot of books that they can look at and go, oh, that person's, dark like I am, or that boy on there has braids like I do. Books. We have little posable families of different colors, and I think it's important to not just expose them to, people that look like themselves, but also people that look different. And so we have different little families they can play with, and just exposing them to a variety of different cultures. And I'd say even more so for your Native students, it's important for them to see themselves in different areas of your classroom. Storytelling is actually a big part of our program, and when I seen that question of storytelling, it made me think of, well, do they need oral stories? And so that made me think of, when oral stories was all that was told. A lot of times for Native Americans, they pass down, morals and lessons in their stories. And I thought, well, we do that in here. I use a ton of books for the social emotional lessons that I'm teaching them. Coming into preschool, that's all you're pretty much teaching them is, how to interact in the classroom. And through that, I use books that teach different lessons in, how to share, how to be kind, how to be a good friend, how to use your voice when someone's bothering you. We use many books in our classroom to tell stories, and my kids love it. They love story time, to sit on the rug. And in our curriculum, there's a large part that uses stories as well to teach the different curriculum and lessons and reinforce those ideas. So it's a big part of our classroom. Knowing that I have found books that relate to their culture, and I have a bookshelf in our classroom that has, just books where they can see part of their culture on there, or see people that are dark like them, or books that talk about fry bread and, things that they have at home. So it's a very big part of our classroom, and there's all kinds of books you can find, if you search. I haven't, not this year due to COVID, but we have had that in the past before in our classrooms, and I've thought of that. I think that would be fantastic if we could have elders, and that's another way you can incorporate that storytelling, have elders come in. I have a couple Napi books of the Blackfeet creation story. I read one with my class the other day during Native American Week in September. I read that. I thought it'd be even more beneficial for them if an elder was able to come in and tell them that, because, they possess a lot more knowledge, and be able to explain to them how and why the creation story came to be. In our school, that's kind of that's a big part of our curriculum anyways. We're doing that all across the curriculum, literacy concepts from our calendar, to lining up, rhyming someone's name to line up. We're always trying to incorporate different concepts for them, because I don't feel like they get enough of it. And so if you're creative, you can find, ways to include it, lining up, to different transitions in your classroom. It's a big part of our day anyways, all throughout the day, and it's always been stressed ever since I've been here. To be a trauma responsive educator is something they hounded into us going to school here, and that's because, working on the reservation, many of your students come to school that don't have their needs met. So to be a responsive, trauma-informed teacher means to be aware of how your students are coming to school with, what some would say are behaviors, and how their needs that aren't getting met at home are affecting them in the classroom. You might have students that come to school hungry because they don't have the food stability at their house. It's hard to learn when you're hungry. Or you might, have students that come to school that don't have a consistent home life. Maybe they're at grandma's one night, and then maybe the next day they're at dad's, and that affects them, whether they're saying it does or not. It's really looking at those behaviors and assessing them, reading your students, so to speak. I have some students who've lost their parents And so then they come into the classroom and they're acting out, and it's easy to take it personally. They don't like me. They don't want to be in my classroom, or just send them to a chair. And but being trauma informed means really looking at them and giving grace. I think that's a huge part of being trauma informed, is giving grace to your students, especially at the preschool level. They don't know how to communicate what they're feeling, and that's what we're teaching them anyway when they come to school. I think an important part of that is having a consistent making your classroom a predictable and consistent classroom. I do that in my classroom by providing a daily schedule. My students can look up at my schedule any part of the day and know where we're at. That consistency eases some of their anxiety when they don't have a consistent home life. And it's also building relationships with your students, because you're not going to know what's going on with them. It's hard to interpret if you don't know them, period. And so building relationships with them and building relationships with their family helps them and puts them at ease. I have a teacher that likes me and tries to understand me. I feel safe in her classroom. I can then learn, because they can't learn when they don't feel safe and when they don't feel like they're loved. I think part of that is in the answer there, the community. A lot of times your Native students do come from a larger community, or I say community, but I mean family. And to me, they're kind of the same, because a lot of times your Native student will have a family, and maybe part of their family aren't biological, but they have that community or tribe, so to speak, that care for them. And through that family and community, they're very resilient. They have people they can turn to. And so I would suggest building a relationship with them. In my classroom, there have been times when I don't have something in my classroom, and it never ceases to amaze me. Browning is mostly living in poverty. They have a large part of the community that's below the poverty level, but that doesn't stop them from a family giving you their last $20 to help pay for another student who doesn't have anything. They're always, always, always willing to share and always willing to help. So the community and family has always been a strength in our classroom. And I would suggest building that with your student, because they usually do come from a larger family. To be honest, I was that way. I was extremely intimidated coming into a school that's largely Blackfeet, and I'm Crow. And so I'm Crow, and I got to teach, students Blackfeet words. I was like, I don't know how to do that. I feel like I sound awkward, and I don't have the right dialect, and I'm saying that word wrong. But I had to move past it and just jump into the language here. And there was lots of times when I would go to, our NAS teacher or someone I knew that knew how to speak it and say, and ask them, am I saying this right? And she told me, she said, just do it. She said, there's so many times, when teachers won't teach language because they're afraid of messing up. And I thought, yeah, that's true, because that's how I was. But you just have to move past that fear and jump into it, because that's what your students need. They need you to be teaching parts of their culture, even if you don't feel comfortable with it. And if you don't feel comfortable with it, ask someone. There's tons of resources online as well. Tons. Just, do your research. I know it's kind of a burden, or, not a burden, but, teachers already do so much. It's kind of, like, oh, now I got to go and research this, but do it. it's worth it for your students. Yeah, well, in Montana, there is 8 federally recognized tribes. We had 7, and then Little Shell, they recognized them. So there's 8, and they're spread across all of Montana. And so, there's no spot in Montana, I feel like, that's too far away from any reservation. If teachers are struggling on where to start, non-native teachers, I would say start, with what tribe is local and go from there. Because chances are you're going to have a native student, and even if you don't, it's important that your students know that there are that many tribes in Montana, and they're not all the same. They're all different. Yeah, we have a lot of concepts that are the same, but they're all different. And I would start with one that's local to you, and then expand upon that and go to the next tribe. And I would also say, don't hesitate to teach uncomfortable subjects. I know a lot of teachers shy away from controversial subjects, but that's our history, and that's your native students' history, and they need to know a part of the history in Montana, a large part of the history. So, don't be scared to use teachable moments in your classroom. It's not the time to freeze up when something uncomfortable comes up. Use that moment, and if you don't know about it, then do your research, and you really got to read your class to see where they're at on this subject, and if they know something or it's a misconception for them, teach them that, teach them the misconception. And there's lots of ways you can incorporate, learning about Native Americans. Use holidays. I know Thanksgiving's a big, kind of, teachers kind of steer clear of that, but there's ways to do it, even at the preschool level. I've heard preschool teachers say, "Oh, I don't do that. I just, let the older grades teach it." And it's never too late to begin planting those seeds with your students. Like I said, this month is Thanksgiving, and we're gonna dive right into it. Starting with, who the Pilgrims came across when they first came here. That's a different tribe. How is their tribe different from our tribe? They didn't live in teepees, and finding the differences between that tribe they came across to the tribe that's maybe near you. How are they different? How are they the same? It's small stuff like that, especially for a younger age, Or I know a lesson we're going to do in our classroom is, what did they wear then? What do they wear now? That's often a misconception in students. We don't live in teepees anymore. That's what we used to live in. How is that different? From then till today. Use those holidays, use teachable moments to bring up cases where you can teach about Native Americans and those tribes within Montana. I would like them to know to challenge themselves. Like I said before, a lot of non-native teachers are kind of hesitant to misteach something or to challenge, what they learned growing up, because oftentimes Native Americans in the history books were definitely a minority, and it wasn't told from their perspective. Use different resources to teach about them. Like I said, there's all kinds of resources. You have the Museum of the Native American. They have tons of resources there. The Smithsonian, and you have the OPI website in Montana. That has a ton of resources on there for teaching lessons for Native American students. students learn better and they have a more positive experience in school when they see and hear their culture in the school. And so as educators, that's honestly your job to provide that for them. If you want to close that gap, you need to include their culture in the classroom some way or another.